Imagine you are standing in front of a firing squad. The rifles are loaded, the soldiers are ready. You have 20, maybe 30 seconds left to live, and you know it. One man stood in that place. He felt all of it. The cold, the silence, the priest's cross, the drum roll, the rifles rising. He is marched into a frozen square in St. Petersburg. Here he is, placed before a firing squad. He is to be shot today, and the final countdown begins. 3, 2, 1. And then, they didn't shoot. The soldiers just received a message that Dostoevsky is pardoned. He won't be executed. Instead, he's being sent to a prison camp. But this near-death experience would forever haunt him. Most people, if they survived that moment, would spend the rest of their lives being careful, safe. They'd be quiet. This man went on to write the most dangerous books in human history. Books that asked, with terrifying precision, whether a person could murder someone and still be good. Whether God could exist in a world built on the suffering of one innocent child. Whether freedom itself might be something people are too afraid to actually want. His name was Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. And what happened to him before he wrote a single word of his masterpieces should be impossible. And what he wrote because of it changed the world forever. But here is the question that will haunt everything you're about to hear. Can suffering make you wise? Or does it only make you more broken? Dostoevsky spent his entire life trying to answer that. And he never fully did. Neither have we. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky was born in Moscow on November 11, 1821, the 30th of October. By the old Julian calendar, Moscow was the nation's former and future capital. In the early 19th century, St. Petersburg held that role instead. His father, Mikhail Dostoevsky, was a military surgeon and civil servant who ran away from a planned career in the priesthood at 15 to study medicine in Moscow. Extensive government service earned him hereditary noble rank in 1828. The family traced its line back 5 centuries. On October 6, 1506, a Lithuanian nobleman named Daniil Irtish had been granted the village of Dostoevo in present-day Belarus, the source of the name that later generations, scattering through Russia, Poland, and Ukraine, would carry into the modern world. Fyodor's own branch produced priests before his father broke with the church to practice medicine. In 1819, the 30-year-old Mikhail married Maria Nechaeva, the 19-year-old daughter of a Moscow merchant family. A first son, Mikhail, arrived in November 1820. Fyodor followed within the year. 5 more children survived infancy, 3 daughters and 2 sons. He was born into a country still absorbing the shock of the Napoleonic Wars. Tsar Alexander I had come to the throne in 1801, hoping to liberalize Russia under the influence of his Swiss tutor, Frédéric César de la Harpe. But the wars swallowed those ambitions. Defeats at Austerlitz in 1805 and Friedland in 1807 forced peace at Tilsit, a reformist interlude under Minister Mikhail Speransky that collapsed by 1812, then Napoleon's invasion and the long campaign that finally broke him in 1814–15. Russian officers who occupied Paris afterward came home having glimpsed a freer Europe. They returned instead to the reactionary rule of General Alexei Arakcheev, and their disappointment curdled for some into secret societies plotting a constitution. Alexander's sudden death in 1825 gave them their opening. Some 3,000 men rose at Senate Square, crushed by artillery, their 5 ringleaders executed, and more than 100 followers sent to Siberia. Nicholas I took the throne in the smoke of that failed uprising, and the tension between reform and repression it exposed would shadow Russian public life and Dostoevsky's own work for the rest of the century. He grew up largely in Moscow, where his father worked at a hospital for the poor, and where the Dostoevsky children were allowed, unusually for their class, to play with the patients' children in the hospital gardens. His father remained a devout Orthodox Christian who introduced Fyodor to the Bible at 4, but was equally insistent on secular learning, reading the boys the history of Nikolai Karamzin and the poetry of Gavrila Derzhavin, Vasily Zhukovsky, and above all, Alexander Pushkin. Fyodor's appetite ran wider still. Homer, Cervantes, Walter Scott, Shakespeare, Schiller, Goethe. In 1831, the family bought the small estate of Darovoye, where they spent 4 months of each year. Fyodor's mother managed it capably and sympathized openly with the serfs who worked it, an unusual sympathy the children were permitted to share. Dostoevsky later called Darovoye the site of his happiest childhood memories, and its people and landscape would resurface, transfigured, in the Brothers Karamazov. Childhood ended abruptly. Sent to boarding school in 1834, the 2 eldest brothers watched their parents' health fail together. Their mother died in February 1837, and within days came news that Pushkin, Fyodor's literary idol, had been killed in a duel. Grief for both compounded into a throat illness that delayed the brothers' journey to St. Petersburg, where their father had enrolled them, against their wishes, in the School of Military Engineering, hoping to secure their futures before his own health gave out. On the road north, the brothers witnessed a government courier beat a coachman senseless for no evident cause, a small casual cruelty that stayed with Fyodor as a symbol of the violence built into Russia's social order. Mikhail failed his medical examination and was diverted to a lesser school in Reval. Fyodor passed after his family paid the customary bribe and began at the engineering school, housed in the old Mikhailovsky Castle, in January 1838, 16 years old, and already more interested in fiction, especially the fantastical tales of E.T.A. Hoffmann, than in military drill. He made few close friends. The poet and civil servant Ivan Shidlovsky, outside the school, did more to encourage his literary ambitions than anyone inside it. A schoolmate the source names as Ivan Beretsky could not be independently confirmed. See flag list. He failed his drill examination that spring and was held back a year, a heavy blow to his father, now drinking heavily at Darovoye after his wife's death and increasingly burdened by his son's demands for money. In June 1839, Fyodor learned his father had died, officially of a stroke. Rumors that the serfs had murdered him circulated for years, and Fyodor himself came to believe them, though historians have never settled the question. Music. Whatever the cause, the loss freed him, financially and otherwise, to pursue literature with fewer constraints. He finished his studies, was commissioned second lieutenant in 1841, free now to live outside the school and take in plays and ballets at the Alexandrinsky Theater, and in 1842 heard the virtuoso Franz Liszt in concert. Such pleasures were not cheap, and despite a steady allowance from Darovoye, now managed by a capable brother-in-law, Dostoevsky was frequently in debt even before he graduated a full lieutenant in August 1843. He left the army in October 1844, determined to live by his pen. Early efforts at playwriting went nowhere. A translation of Balzac's Eugénie Grandet, sold in 1843, did better and pointed him toward the realist fiction that would make his name.
If you want to read or listen any of Dostoevsky books, check out the description.
His first novel, Poor Folk, finished in 1845 and published that January, was an overnight sensation. It's told through the letters of a minor bureaucrat, Makar Devushkin, and a young woman, Varvara Dobroselova, whose bond holds them both up until her marriage to the wealthy Bykov ends it. The poet Nikolai Nekrasov praised it, and more importantly, so did the critic Vissarion Belinsky, whose endorsement made Dostoevsky's reputation overnight. Gogol's clerks had been figures of ridicule. Dostoevsky's asked for sympathy and got it. He was welcomed into Belinsky's circle as its newest star, and by his own later admission, the attention went straight to his head. The young writer, Ivan Turgenev, mocked him mercilessly for it, and after one especially humiliating evening in November 1846, Dostoevsky stopped showing up. Belinsky's praise soured too, especially after The Double, a stranger, more claustrophobic book where a minor clerk named Golyatkin gets undone by a more socially adept doppelganger. The final break, in early 1847, was ideological. Both men had drawn on the Christian utopian socialism of French writers like Charles Fourier, but Belinsky's socialism was hardening into atheism, and Dostoevsky couldn't follow him there. He was shaken anyway to learn of Belinsky's death from tuberculosis the following year at 36. Cut loose from Belinsky's circle, Dostoevsky drifted into another, an informal group hosted by his former classmate Alexei Beketov, and through the Beketovs into the orbit of Mikhail Butashevich Petrushevsky, a socialist aristocrat whose Friday gatherings.
As the revolutions of 1848 swept Europe, the Petrushevsky circle swelled with more radical members, among them Nikolai Speshnev, sometimes called Russia's first communist, who pulled Dostoevsky into a smaller, secret society tied to a further offshoot, the Palm-Durov Circle, dedicated to spreading revolutionary literature through the capital. In April 1849, uneasy about informers, but unable to stop himself, Dostoevsky read aloud Belinsky's banned letter to Gogol, a furious indictment of serfdom and the Orthodox Church's complicity in it. His unease turned out to be justified. An informant named Antonelli had already infiltrated the group. In the early hours of April 23, 1849, some 60 members were arrested and hauled off to the Peter and Paul fortress. Under interrogation, Dostoevsky admitted to holding revolutionary ideas. He named no one else. That autumn, a military court condemned a group of the accused, Dostoevsky included, to death. The source dates the sentencing to September and gives the number condemned as 15. Most historical accounts place it in mid-November and put the number at 21. See the flag list. Nicholas I reviewed the sentences and commuted them to hard labor, but staged the reprieve as a demonstration of his own power over life and death. On the morning of December 22, 1849, Dostoevsky and his fellow prisoners were marched to Semyonovsky Square and told, for the first time, that they were about to die by firing squad. A priest climbed the scaffold with a cross, and even the circle's confirmed atheists came forward to kiss it. Petrushevsky and 2 others were bound to stakes and blindfolded. Dostoevsky, in the second group of 3, watched the rifles rise and waited his turn, certain he had only moments left. The drums rolled. Then, instead of the volley, the soldiers lowered their weapons. A rider had arrived at a gallop with the Tsar's pardon. Dostoevsky's death sentence became 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, to be followed by indefinite army service, the price of getting his civil rights back. Dostoevsky's journey to Siberia began on the 24th of December, 1849. He reached the prison at Omsk in late January, 1850. The barracks he shared with the other convicts were suffocating in summer and bitterly cold in winter, and conditions only got worse under the sadistic commandant, Major Krivtsov. It was here, under this treatment, that Dostoevsky is believed to have had his first epileptic seizures, a condition that would recur more and more often for the rest of his life. He was forbidden to write and allowed only the New Testament to read. He served his time alongside hardened criminals who despised the gentlemen among them as privileged and useless with their hands. Contempt Dostoevsky at first returned in full. That mutual hostility didn't last. Over 4 years, Dostoevsky came to see the peasant convicts not as the brutes he'd assumed, but as the raw material of Russia's eventual salvation. Men whose crimes he learned to read as consequences of circumstance, not some innate depravity. Some of what he saw stayed with him less as doctrine than as detail. Skilled convicts fashioning trinkets to trade for one night's drunkenness, the one freedom the prison code couldn't fully take from them, worth far more, to Dostoevsky, to the men who bought it, than the few kopecks it cost. He'd gone to Siberia believing, as a member of the intelligentsia, that he understood the Russian people and owed them enlightenment. 4 years changed his mind entirely. He came out believing the intellectuals understood nothing, and that Russia's truth belonged to the people they'd presumed to instruct. It reoriented everything he'd later write: his sense of crime, of punishment, of what the mind does under pressure, and increasingly, his faith. Petrushevsky's circle had given him abstractions. Semyonovsky Square and Omsk gave him something rawer. Over one December morning and 4 subsequent years, the nihilism and utopian socialism of his 20s broke open into something closer to a Christian understanding of suffering as the road to redemption, and his later philosophy never really left that ground again. His sentence ended in February 1854, and Dostoevsky was posted as a private soldier to the 7th Line Battalion at SEMIPALATINSK, a garrison town in present-day Kazakhstan. His literary reputation bought him better treatment than most former convicts got, and before long he was allowed to live independently, read, and write. He befriended Baron Alexander Wrangel, a young lawyer newly arrived as a prosecutor, and the two shared quarters while Wrangel worked, unsuccessfully at first, to get Dostoevsky a pardon from the new Tsar, Alexander II, after Nicholas I's death in 1855. In Semipalatinsk, tutoring the children of local officials, Dostoevsky fell for Maria Iseva, the unhappy wife of a drunken minor official. Her husband's death in 1855 opened the way to marriage, but only after a rough courtship. Maria was drawn to a younger rival, and a private soldier made a poor prospect regardless of the competition. Dostoevsky's luck changed in 1856 when an appeal to General Eduard Totleben, a former schoolmate famous by then for his fortifications at Sevastopol during the Crimean War, secured him a promotion to officer rank. He married Maria in February 1857, and the marriage was troubled almost immediately. An epileptic seizure on the journey back to SEMIPALATINSK terrified his new wife, and she came to regret marrying, in her own words, a middle-aged epileptic of uncertain prospects. Barred from living in Moscow or St. Petersburg, the couple settled for a while in Tver, directly on the road between them, until Dostoevsky successfully petitioned the Tsar to lift the restriction. He returned to St. Petersburg in December 1859, after a decade away. His politics transformed from the westernizing radical of the 1840s into a committed Slavophile. The intellectual landscape had shifted too. Alexander Herzen now shaped opinion from exile in London through his journal, The Bell. Nikolai Chernyshevsky edited The Contemporary back home. Dostoevsky's brother Mikhail had secured permission in 1858 to launch a journal of their own, Time, though it didn't actually start publishing until March 1861, and didn't find its footing until after Fyodor's return, when his prison memoir, The House of the Dead, ran in its pages and became the journal's signature work. In its columns, Dostoevsky staked out a position against Chernyshevsky's insistence that art justify itself through political utility. Art, he argued, earned its place through its own beauty. It served humanity simply by existing. Serfdom was abolished in February 1861, a reform Dostoevsky welcomed even as its terms buried the peasantry in new debts and fed the unrest that sent Chernyshevsky himself into Siberian exile the following year. Dostoevsky toured Western Europe that summer and came home unimpressed. Paris struck him as a city where liberty was for sale and only the wealthy could afford it. London's wealth sat beside a poverty that appalled him, not least the sight of women selling their own daughters on the street, and a visit to the International Exhibition in South Kensington left him cold. Its vaunted halls of progress read to him as grotesque, almost satanic, monuments to a civilization mistaking material abundance for the good life. He met Herzen and the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin while he was there. His account of the trip, Winter Notes on Summer Impressions, confirmed a conviction that would only deepen, that the West, for all his respect for its literature, had lost its moral bearings and Russia's future lay elsewhere. The years that followed brought one loss after another. Dostoevsky's marriage to Maria had effectively ended by 1861. She'd moved, consumptive, to Vladimir, while he began an affair with Polina Suslova, a young radical who saw in Dostoevsky a champion of liberty against oppression, even as her convictions and his clashed about as often as their affections lined up. She resented his opposition to female emancipation. He chafed at her demands that he divorce his dying wife. In 1863, the two of them set out for Europe together, but Suslova sailed ahead without him, and by the time Dostoevsky reached Paris, having stopped to gamble and lose at Wiesbaden, she'd already taken up with another man who soon abandoned her in turn. Dostoevsky talked her into traveling on with him anyway, on the promise of a purely platonic arrangement. That promise didn't survive contact with Suslova's taste for making him jealous, and the two parted ways in Turin, she for Paris, he for the gaming tables of Baden-Baden. Time itself didn't survive the year either. A censor's misreading of an article on the Polish uprising of 1863 got the journal shut down that May. Dostoevsky, recalled to Russia by news of his wife's decline, reconciled with her at her bedside in Vladimir that October. As she lay dying, he wrote notes from the underground, a bleak rebuttal of the idea, laid out in Chernyshevsky's novel What Is to Be Done, that reason alone could guide people toward the common good. Maria died on April 15, 1864. His brother Mikhail followed her to the grave that July, leaving debts that Fyodor took on along with the editorship of Mikhail's second journal, Epoch, which folded anyway in March 1865 for lack of money. Determined to fund another European trip despite his debts, Dostoevsky sold a publisher named Fyodor Dostoevsky the rights to a 3-volume edition of his work for a mere 3,000 rubles, with a catastrophic penalty clause attached. Deliver a new manuscript by November 1, 1866, or forfeit the right to publish anything free of charge for 9 years. He promptly went to Wiesbaden and gambled away what little he had, then came back and began, in genuine desperation, the novel that would become his masterpiece. Crime and Punishment, serialized through 1866, follows Rodion Raskolnikov, an impoverished former student who talks himself into believing that murdering a hated, miserly pawnbroker, a woman who does nothing useful with her hoarded wealth, would be not merely excusable but almost a public service, the act of a Napoleon among lesser men. He kills her, and in a panic, her sister too, and the novel that follows tracks the unraveling of his conscience more than his crime. Confession, Siberia, and under the influence of the compassionate Sonia Marmeladova, who follows him into exile, the beginning of redemption through faith. Some radical critics accused Dostoevsky of libeling Russian students. The critic Nikolai Strakov countered that Raskolnikov was no caricature, but a portrait of a mind in genuine existential crisis. Dostoevsky knew he'd written something extraordinary and sold the book itself to Mikhail Katkov's Russian messenger rather than hand it over to Stolovsky, which left him barely a month to produce the second manuscript his contract demanded. On a friend's advice, he hired a stenographer. On October 4, 1866, 20-year-old Anna Snitkina arrived at his apartment, and together, working fast, they produced a complete manuscript, the novel The Gambler, by the end of the month. Somewhere in that collaboration, Dostoevsky described to Anna as if he were talking through a novel he might write, a middle-aged writer unsure whether a young woman could ever love him. When he asked Anna to imagine herself as that woman, she understood he wasn't speaking hypothetically anymore, and answered with an open declaration of love. They married on February 15, 1867. The 7,000 rubles Dostoevsky got for the book edition of Crime and Punishment fell well short of covering his debts.
Marriage didn't bring stability. The couple's honeymoon, meant to last weeks, stretched to 4 years abroad as Dostoevsky's creditors closed in and his gambling, briefly renewed, ate up whatever money came their way. At Bad Homburg, he lost everything in 10 days. In Baden-Baden, Anna was reduced to pawning her wedding ring and her own clothes just to bail him out. Old wounds reopened too. A chance encounter with Turgenev, now settled in Baden-Baden, ended in mutual insults. It took real hardship, a ruinous session at the gambling tables of Saxon-les-Bains that November, to finally push Dostoevsky toward a new novel, The Idiot, which he began in earnest that winter, writing 100 pages in 23 days. Tragedy interrupted the work. A daughter, Sonia, born in March 1868 and named for Crime and Punishment's heroine, died of pneumonia 3 months later. Grief followed the family from Geneva to Vevey, where Dostoevsky finished the novel's difficult second half, then on to Milan and Florence, where he finally completed it in January 1869. Its hero, Prince Mishkin, is an epileptic returning to Russia from a Swiss sanatorium, modeled partly on Christ's example in the Gospel of John and partly on the Russian folk figure of the Eurodivi, the holy fool whose humiliations grant him license to speak uncomfortable truths. Torn between two women, the tormented Nastasia Filipovna and the innocent Aglaya, Mishkin's compassion draws him toward marrying Nastasia to save her from despair, only for her to be murdered on their wedding day by the wealthy Rogozhin, who'd pursued her throughout the novel. Rogozhin gets 15 years in Siberia. Mishkin returns, broken, to the sanatorium. Dostoevsky admitted he'd written much of the book without knowing how it would end, and critics found the unresolved tragedy unsatisfying. His ideals of love and forgiveness, in Mishkin's hands, couldn't save anyone. One biographer, the source's rendering of the name didn't resolve cleanly, possibly Gir Kietsa, argued the novel's real point was that Mishkin's example might still have redeemed the people around him had they only lived up to it. See the flag list. A second daughter, Lyubov, was born in Dresden on September 26th, and the family stayed abroad through Prussia's victory over France and the birth of a unified German Empire. Those developments, plus a looming ban on casino gambling, finally sent Dostoevsky home to Russia in July 1871, funded by the proceeds of his next novel, Devils. The book, also known as Demons or The Possessed, grew out of the real 1869 murder of a student, Ivan Ivanov, by the revolutionary Sergei Nechaev's circle for refusing to fall in line. Dostoevsky read the episode as proof that rationalist utopian politics, for all its promises of total freedom, produced only despotism and violence, and he built the novel close to a religious allegory. Pyotr Verkhovensky, the group's chief agitator, as a manifestation of the serpent. Nikolai Stavrogin, the charismatic figurehead too disillusioned to lead, as the false messiah of Revelation. Around them, Dostoevsky sketched something close to satire. Revolutionaries who talk endlessly about organizing and never do, until Verkhovensky forces the murder of a defector, Shatov, to bind the group in shared guilt, and pushes the philosophically suicidal engineer, Alexei Kirillov, into finally carrying out his long-deferred self-destruction. Back in St. Petersburg at 50, Dostoevsky found a son, also named Fyodor, born within days of his return, and a stack of overdue bills waiting alongside him. Anna took charge of the family finances, securing her husband's publishing rights and negotiating with his creditors. And by 1872, Dostoevsky was famous enough that the collector Pavel Tretyakov commissioned a portrait of him from the painter Vasily Perov. That image, now hanging in Moscow's Tretyakov Gallery, is still how most people picture him. He cultivated new, more conservative allies too, the journalist Prince Vladimir Meshchersky and the lawyer Konstantin Pobedonostsev, tutor to the heir to the throne, the future Alexander III. Dostoevsky sent Pobedonostsev's pupil a copy of Devils on its book publication in 1873. The same year, Anna's new publishing venture sold out its full print run of 3,000 copies. Editing Meshchersky's journal, The Citizen, that same year, Dostoevsky launched a column called Diary of a Writer, part memoir, part running commentary on Russian life, and resigned the editorship in 1874 after repeated friction with the censors. The source states Dostoevsky relaunched the diary in 1876 through Nekrasov's Notes of the Fatherland. In fact, it became Dostoevsky's own independent, self-published monthly from that year. See the flag list. He split these years between St. Petersburg, treatment for worsening lung trouble at the German spa of Bad Ems, and summers at Staraya Russa on Lake Ilmen, where a second son, Alexei, was born in August 1875. The novel he was writing there, The Adolescent, returned to a question that had already shadowed Devils, a father's failures visited on his son, through its illegitimate hero, Arkady Dolgoruki, caught between his biological father, the feckless aristocrat Versilov, and a truer spiritual guide in the peasant pilgrim Makar. Russia's war with the Ottoman Empire in 1877 found Dostoevsky an enthusiastic supporter, cheering the campaign to liberate Ottoman Christians and calling for Constantinople itself to fall to Russian hands. His stature by now reached the court. Tsar Alexander II subscribed to his diary, and in 1878, Dostoevsky was invited to spend time with the Tsar's younger sons, Sergei and Pavel. That spring brought an invitation to an international literary gathering in Paris presided over by Victor Hugo, whom Dostoevsky had idolized since childhood. Then, in May 1878, his 3-year-old son Alexei died after a series of epileptic seizures, the condition inherited unmistakably from his father. Dostoevsky sought consolation from the revered Elder Ambrose at the Optina Pustin Monastery, an encounter that would shape the character of Father Zosima in the novel he was already beginning to imagine. That autumn, the family moved back into the same St. Petersburg apartment where Dostoevsky had lived at the start of his literary career, decades before.
The first installments of what Theodore came to entitle Crime and Punishment were published in The Russian Messenger in early 1866. The protagonist, Rodion Raskolnikov, is a young man living in abject poverty after being expelled from university. He is further troubled by the plight of his widowed mother and his young sister, who has been subject to harassment by a landowner. Inspired by great men of action such as Napoleon Bonaparte, Raskolnikov plans to solve all his problems at once by murdering an elderly pawnbroker with a reputation for lending money at punitive rates and stealing her money. This hateful old woman hides away her wealth and does not even do anything useful with it. If only Raskolnikov could get his hands on the money, then at a stroke he could improve his own condition and have money left over to support his mother and sister. He believes this is justifiable, as he is capable of becoming a great man like Napoleon, if only society affords him the financial means to achieve his goals. Armed with an axe, Raskolnikov successfully kills the old woman and then kills her sister, who stumbles upon the scene. Keen to make a quick getaway after the double murder, Raskolnikov takes only a handful of items and leaves most of the pawnbroker's wealth behind. The remainder of the novel deals with Raskolnikov's psychology as he grapples with his inner sense of guilt over his crimes while trying to claim his innocence to authorities. Eventually, his conscience forces him to confess to the crime, and he is sent to Siberia, where he achieves full redemption through renewed faith in God under the influence of the compassionate Sonia Marmeladova, who accompanies him into exile. The novel was an instant success and enthralled the reading public. But some radical critics attacked Dostoevsky for slandering Russian students in his depiction of Raskolnikov. However, the critic Nikolai Strakov argued that rather than presenting Raskolnikov as an excessively sympathetic figure, Dostoevsky presented a deeply complex figure grappling with existential doubt after committing his crimes.
The Brothers Karamazov began serialization in the Russian Messenger in January 1879. It was the book Dostoevsky had spent 30 years since Siberia writing toward. Its three brothers, Dmitry, Ivan, and Alyosha, sons of the depraved Fyodor Karamazov by 2 marriages, with a rumored illegitimate 4th son, the servant Pavel Smerdyakov, waiting in the wings, carry the full weight of the philosophical argument Dostoevsky had spent his career developing. Dmitry and his father become rivals for Grushenka. Fyodor Karamazov turns up murdered. Dmitry, driven by his open hatred of the old man, becomes the obvious suspect, while Smerdyakov, faking an epileptic seizure as his alibi, is in fact the real killer. Acting, he later confesses to Ivan, on the rationalist principle that if God doesn't exist, everything is permitted. Ivan's mind buckles under the truth. Smerdyakov kills himself. Dmitry, wrongly convicted and sentenced to 20 years in Siberia, plans an escape to America with Grushenka instead of serving a punishment he doesn't deserve. It's Alyosha's conversations with his brothers that carry the novel's real argument, though. Above all, Ivan's case against God in the chapter known as The Grand Inquisitor, a parable set during the Spanish Inquisition, in which a returning Christ is arrested and condemned to burn for the crime of having given humanity a freedom it never wanted, one the Church has since had to manage on its behalf. Dostoevsky answers Ivan not with a counter-argument, but with a life. The dying father Zosima's insistence that no one can judge another's sin, since everyone shares responsibility for it, and that suffering honestly borne leads, in the end, to redemption. It's the same conviction Dostoevsky had reached in the Omsk barracks 30 years earlier, now given its fullest expression. His health was failing as he wrote it. A 4th visit to Bad Ems in 1879 produced a diagnosis of pulmonary emphysema, manageable, he was told, but not curable. In February 1880, he was elected vice president of the Slavic Benevolent Society, an honor that carried him to Moscow for the unveiling on June 18, 1880, of a monument to a poet then over 40 years dead. His address 2 days later, on June 20th, cast Pushkin as a prophet of Russian universal love and called on his fractious countrymen to set their quarrels aside. The speech moved even his old rival Turgenev to tears, though the unity it inspired didn't last. Critics on both the left and the right turned on Dostoevsky within weeks. He finished The Brothers Karamazov exhausted, worn down by the criticism and by a relentless schedule of public readings. On February 6, 1881, agitated by a police search underway in a neighboring apartment, he suffered a pulmonary hemorrhage. A second followed the next day, after a family argument over an inheritance. He took the sacrament and asked his wife, Anna. The source's transcript reads Allah at this point, almost certainly a mishearing of Anna, see the flag list, to read their children the parable of the prodigal son. He seemed to rally, briefly. A third hemorrhage, on the evening of February 9, 1881, killed him. He was 59. 3 days later, tens of thousands of mourners followed his coffin to the Alexander Nevsky Lavra, where he was buried near two of the writers who'd shaped him as a boy, Karamzin and Zhukovsky.
Freedom is not a political concept for Dostoevsky. It is not about voting rights, constitutional protections, or economic systems. Freedom is the metaphysical foundation of human existence itself, what separates human beings from animals, machines, even angels. It is the most precious and most terrible gift we possess, the source of both our greatest glory and our deepest misery. Most people, when they think of freedom, imagine the ability to do whatever they want without interference, freedom from external constraints. Dostoevsky is talking about something far more disturbing: the freedom to choose between good and evil, the freedom to act against your own self-interest, the freedom to destroy yourself and others for no rational reason at all, the freedom to say no to God, to happiness, to love, to life itself. This freedom is not optional. We cannot surrender it even if we want to. Try to hand your freedom over to an authority figure, a political system, a religious institution. You are still making a free choice to surrender. Claim that your actions are determined by genetics, by conditioning, by unconscious drives. You are still freely choosing to accept that explanation. Freedom haunts every human moment, lurking behind every decision, however small or automatic it feels. We are condemned to be free, and this condemnation is the source of human anxiety, guilt, and existential terror. Why would a loving God curse human beings with such a frightening responsibility? Because without freedom, goodness would be meaningless. A robot programmed to help people is not morally praiseworthy. An animal defending its young is not exhibiting virtue. Only a being who could choose evil but freely chooses good deserves moral credit. Only a being who could despair but freely chooses hope is exhibiting real courage. But here Dostoevsky becomes truly radical. Most human beings, he argues, cannot handle this level of freedom. It is too terrifying, too overwhelming, and faced with it, they will do almost anything to escape. They surrender their autonomy to leaders who promise to take care of them. They adopt rigid ideologies that tell them exactly what to think and feel. They lose themselves in addictions and mindless distraction. Anything to avoid the terrible responsibility of choosing who they want to be. This is the fundamental tragedy of human existence. The very thing that makes us human is the thing most of us desperately want to escape. We want to be free, but not the responsibility that comes with it. We want to be good, but not the struggle against the temptation to be evil. Dostoevsky dramatizes this tragedy through the underground man, a former government clerk, withdrawn from society, who spends his days writing bitter notes on the nature of existence. He is highly intelligent, deeply self-aware, and completely miserable. He knows exactly what he should do to improve his life. He refuses to do it. He sabotages his own happiness, wrecks his relationships, wallows in his own suffering, because misery, chosen, is the only way he can prove he is not a machine programmed for happiness. He would rather suffer as a free being than be content as a slave. We will choose suffering over happiness, Dostoevsky discovered, if suffering is the only way left to demonstrate our autonomy. We will embrace irrationality as rebellion against any system that tries to reduce us to a formula. We are willing to go to hell as long as it is a hell we chose for ourselves rather than a heaven imposed on us. This has profound implications for politics, psychology, religion, and every other domain of human concern. Any system that tries to perfect human beings by eliminating their capacity for free choice will ultimately fail. Any ideology promising happiness by removing the possibility of unhappiness will produce rebellion and resentment instead. But Dostoevsky does not stop at this negative insight. He also shows us freedom exercised in the service of love rather than rebellion. Characters like Alyosha Karamazov and Prince Mishkin demonstrate that it is possible to freely choose goodness, compassion, self-sacrifice, and they are not weak or naive in choosing it. They understand the full horror of human existence, the reality of evil, the temptation to despair. They choose love anyway, and that choice is not determined by genetics, upbringing, or circumstance. It is a free act of will that transcends all natural and social causation. This positive freedom cannot be programmed, taught, or legislated into existence. It must be chosen freely in the depths of the soul, and it must be chosen again and again, moment by moment, across an entire lifetime. This is why Dostoevsky believed freedom was ultimately a spiritual category rather than a political or psychological one. True freedom comes not from the absence of external constraint, but from the presence of internal grace. The freedom to love even when love is not returned, to forgive even when forgiveness is not deserved, to hope even when hope seems impossible. And the path to this higher freedom runs directly through suffering, which is perhaps the hardest part of Dostoevsky's philosophy for modern people to accept. We live in a culture that treats suffering as an evil to be eliminated through technology, therapy, or reform. Dostoevsky argues instead that suffering is often the only way human beings learn to exercise their freedom responsibly. It breaks down our illusions of self-sufficiency, strips away our social masks, and opens the heart to redemption. Without it, he believed, we remain spiritually immature, incapable of genuine love or authentic choice. In 1864, Dostoevsky created a character who would become the archetypal figure of modern alienation. The Underground Man is more than a literary creation. He is a prophetic sketch of what human consciousness would become in the modern world. The first fully self-aware neurotic in literature, a man whose intelligence has become his curse, and whose self-consciousness has paralyzed him completely. He opens his confession with words that have echoed through philosophy and psychology for over a century and a half. He declares himself a sick man, a spiteful man, an unattractive man. These are not mere insults hurled at himself. They are precise diagnoses of a new form of consciousness emerging in the modern world. He is sick with excessive self-awareness, spiteful because his intelligence has revealed the futility of existence as he sees it, unattractive because his hyperactive mind has made him incapable of natural, spontaneous connection. His fundamental problem is that he thinks too much. In earlier ages, people could act on instinct, tradition, or faith without endless self-questioning. But the Underground Man has been exposed to modern education and philosophical skepticism, and he cannot accept anything on faith, cannot act on impulse without analyzing his motives, cannot make a decision without anticipating every possible objection to it. He is trapped in what we might now call analysis paralysis, a condition Dostoevsky rendered in fiction decades before psychology gave it a name. This excessive consciousness creates a terrible problem for action. He knows exactly what he should do to improve his life. But knowing and doing are two different things. He should exercise, but he analyzes his motives for exercising until the impulse dies. He should socialize.
But he anticipates every possible embarrassment until he talks himself out of leaving his apartment. Intelligence, which should be humanity's greatest gift, has become his curse. His problems run deeper than overthinking, though. He has lost the ability to feel things purely. Every experience passes through so many layers of self-consciousness that the original feeling is distorted beyond recognition. Anger becomes self-hatred by the time he has finished dissecting its legitimacy, its causes, how others will judge it. He becomes a stranger to his own inner life, watching his own thoughts as if they belonged to someone else, divided against himself. One part of his mind constantly observing and judging the rest. Authentic self-expression becomes impossible. Everything he says feels calculated, filtered through too many layers of watching himself. He also suffers from what we would now call social anxiety. Again, a condition Dostoevsky rendered in fiction before psychology named it. He desperately wants human connection, but his self-consciousness makes ordinary interaction almost impossible. In a room full of people, he immediately begins reading every glance and gesture as evidence of rejection. He becomes so focused on managing how he appears that he loses the ability to simply be present. This creates a vicious cycle. Isolation breeds awkwardness. Awkwardness breeds further isolation until he develops elaborate theories about why solitude is actually preferable to human company. Theories that are really just defense mechanisms dressed up as philosophy. He has transformed his psychological wounds into intellectual positions. He also embodies what we would call cognitive dissonance. He holds contradictory beliefs and desires simultaneously, and the tension between them drives him toward increasingly irrational behavior. He claims to value reason above all else, then acts against all reason. He insists he wants to be left alone, then rages when he is ignored. He declares his independence from conventional morality, then tortures himself with guilt over minor transgressions. These contradictions are not accidental. They are built into the structure of modern consciousness itself, educated to believe in reason and individual autonomy, while the heart still yearns for meaning, connection, and transcendence that those things alone cannot supply. This conflict produces a suffering that is distinctly modern. Earlier ages suffered from poverty, disease, war, terrible, but comprehensible and shared. The underground man suffers from something more subtle and more isolating, the inability to believe in anything, to feel anything purely, to connect authentically with anyone. This is the suffering of alienation, and in some ways, it is more devastating than physical hardship, because it attacks the very core of what makes life worth living. His response to this suffering is both pathetic and prophetic. Unable to find genuine meaning, he begins to cultivate his suffering as if it were a work of art, developing theories about why suffering is superior to happiness, convincing himself that his alienation is a mark of superior sensitivity. This is precisely what would happen across large stretches of 20th century intellectual life, from existentialism to postmodernism to various movements built on identity and grievance. When people cannot find positive meaning, They often find meaning in their alienation instead. But Dostoevsky does not merely diagnose the crisis of modern consciousness. He gestures toward its cure, though it is not an easy one. The underground man's problems stem from his excessive reliance on rational analysis and his disconnection from love, faith, and self-transcendence. These cannot be recovered through more thinking. They require a fundamental reorientation of the soul toward something greater than the individual ego, learning to stop analyzing himself long enough to actually live, to stop protecting himself long enough to love, to stop asserting his autonomy long enough to surrender to something beyond it. This is why Dostoevsky believed the crisis of modern consciousness was ultimately spiritual rather than psychological or social. No amount of therapy or reform could solve the underground man's problem. He needed grace. And grace comes only to those who acknowledge their own helplessness and open themselves to it. When Dostoevsky looked at the intellectual currents of his time, he saw humanity rushing towards spiritual catastrophe. The 19th century was the age of scientific progress and utopian social planning. Intellectuals across Europe believed reason could solve every problem, eliminate suffering, and build perfect societies. Science would replace religion, education would eliminate ignorance, proper social organization would end poverty and crime. To most educated people of his era, these beliefs seemed obviously correct and morally admirable. Dostoevsky saw them as dangerous delusions likely to produce unprecedented destruction. The fundamental error of rationalism, in his view, is its misunderstanding of human nature. Rationalists assume people are essentially logical creatures who calculate their self-interest and pursue it. That irrational or self-destructive behavior must trace back to poor education or corrupted social conditions, fixable through reform. This view is humane, but Dostoevsky recognized it as a catastrophic misreading of human psychology. We are not primarily rational creatures. We are emotional, spiritual, and often deeply irrational beings who frequently act against our own interest for reasons that have nothing to do with logic. Sometimes suffering feels more authentic than manufactured happiness. Sometimes we reject good advice because accepting it would mean admitting we need help. Sometimes we embrace destructive behavior for the sense of power or autonomy it gives us. Dostoevsky illustrates this everywhere in his fiction. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment commits murder, not because it serves his rational self-interest, but because he wants to prove himself extraordinary enough to transcend moral law. The underground man sabotages his own happiness, not from ignorance of what would make him happy, but because choosing misery is the only way he can assert his freedom. Ivan Karamazov builds elaborate arguments against God, not because the evidence clearly supports atheism, but because he cannot bear the emotional weight of a God who permits innocent suffering. In each case, behavior is driven by psychological needs that have nothing to do with calculation. The implications for utopian politics are devastating. If people do not behave rationally, rational social planning cannot build perfect societies. If antisocial behavior is driven by forces beneath conscious awareness, education and reform cannot simply erase it. Rationalist reformers are trying to solve human problems with tools inadequate to the task, like doctors attempting to cure grief with surgery.
Dostoevsky's critique goes further still. He argues that excessive reliance on reason actually makes human problems worse. People who try to live purely rational lives cut themselves off from their own emotional and spiritual depths, becoming like the underground man, trapped inside their own heads, unable to feel genuine emotion or make authentic connection. Rationalism does not solve the human condition. It impoverishes it. Scientific materialism compounds the damage. When people come to see themselves as nothing more than machines governed by physical and chemical law, they lose their sense of dignity and moral responsibility. If behavior can be fully explained by genetics, neurology, and conditioning, what happens to guilt, to striving, to sacrifice for higher principles? If there are no higher principles, only competing biological drives and social pressures? Dostoevsky saw that materialism, followed to its logical end, produces nihilism, the conviction that nothing has ultimate meaning or value. This realization drives sensitive people to despair and less sensitive people to the ruthless pursuit of power and pleasure. The political consequences are frightening. If there is no objective moral truth, then might makes right. If human beings have no inherent dignity, they can be exploited without qualm. If reason alone confers legitimate authority, then intellectuals gain license to impose their schemes on everyone else, regardless of what ordinary people want. Dostoevsky saw that this combination, nihilism plus rationalism, would eventually produce movements willing to treat human beings as raw material for social engineering. His novels are full of characters who embodied the pattern. Raskolnikov believes exceptional individuals may transgress moral law for rational purposes. The revolutionaries of demons commit murder and terrorism in service of ideology. The Grand Inquisitor argues that the masses cannot handle freedom and must be managed by an enlightened elite. In every case, rational arguments dress up irrational and
immoral behavior. The characters convince themselves they serve a higher purpose while really serving their own need for power and revenge. Rationalism and materialism also fail to satisfy the deepest human needs for meaning, beauty, love, transcendence, the sense that one's choices matter in some ultimate way. A worldview that reduces everything to matter in motion cannot account for consciousness or moral obligation. It leaves people spiritually starved amid material abundance, and that starvation gets filled with substitutes: addiction to pleasure and novelty, the accumulation of wealth and status, identification with grand historical movements. None of it satisfies the underlying need. It only distracts from the emptiness rationalism and materialism have created. Dostoevsky's alternative was not irrationalism. He was himself a highly intellectual man, deeply engaged with the philosophy and science of his time, and his critique of reason was made using reason. What he insisted was that reason must be balanced by faith, emotion, and spiritual intuition. That all our faculties need to work in harmony, because reason without faith turns cold and destructive, while faith without reason turns fanatical. This is also why he placed such weight on suffering. It breaks down intellectual pride and forces us to confront what reason alone cannot penetrate. A person who has never suffered deeply tends to remain trapped in the illusion that life can be mastered by intelligence and will. A person broken by suffering and healed by grace understands that reality is far stranger and more mysterious than any rational system can capture. One of Dostoevsky's most disturbing insights was that evil does not come primarily from ignorance or external circumstance. It comes from the human heart itself. This was a revolutionary and deeply unpopular claim in the 19th century, when most intellectuals believed human nature was fundamentally good and evil behavior, the product of corrupted institutions. Eliminate poverty, improve education, reform social structures, and crime and moral corruption would follow them out the door. Dostoevsky had seen too much of human nature in its raw form to accept such optimism. That understanding was shaped by his own experience in a Siberian prison camp, 4 years spent among murderers and thieves. He expected to find men driven to crime by desperation or lack of education. Instead, he found that many had committed their crimes by choice. Some seemed to enjoy violence for its own sake. Others appeared to have killed or stolen as a form of self-assertion, rebellion against social authority, a desire to know what it felt like to cross the line separating civilized behavior from absolute barbarity. What disturbed him most was not that these men were evil, but that they were recognizably human, sharing the same capacity for reason and feeling as law-abiding citizens, some of them intelligent, some even charming. They had simply made choices that led them down dark paths. If people like this could become violent criminals, the potential for evil existed in everyone. This forced an uncomfortable conclusion. We are not blank slates who turn good or evil purely according to environment. We are complex beings carrying genuine impulses toward evil alongside our capacity for sainthood, and which path we take depends less on circumstance than on the moral choices made in the depths of the soul. Dostoevsky explores this most powerfully through Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. An intelligent, sensitive young man from a respectable family, not driven to murder by poverty alone, though poverty plays its part. He chooses to kill because he wants to prove himself an extraordinary individual, one who can transcend conventional morality. He has rationalized the murder of a worthless pawnbroker and the redistribution of her money to the deserving poor as a morally justified act. But Dostoevsky shows us that this rational justification is really an elaborate self-deception. The true motivation is psychological, not philosophical. He wants to feel what it is to hold the power of life and death over another person. The murder is not about helping the poor. It is about feeding his own need to feel powerful, and that psychological profile is not so different from that of countless intellectuals and revolutionaries who have justified murder and terror in the name of serving humanity. Raskolnikov is the prototype of the educated person who uses rational argument to justify what is, underneath, irrational and evil. Dostoevsky also understood that evil often arrives not through dramatic moral failure, but through a slow accumulation of small compromises. Most people do not wake up one morning and decide to become tyrants. They tell small lies that prepare them for bigger ones, rationalize minor selfishness that prepares them for major selfishness, ignore small injustices that prepare them to participate in larger ones, until a pattern of moral numbness makes serious evil possible. The Brothers Karamazov dramatizes this through Shmerdyakov, who murders his father Fyodor. Shmerdyakov is not born evil. He grows up amid moral corruption and cynicism, observes the hypocrisy of the adults around him, and gradually learns to manipulate others for his own advantage, developing a philosophy of nihilistic opportunism that justifies whatever serves his interest.
By the time he commits murder, he has already lost any real capacity for moral feeling. The crime is the logical endpoint of a lifetime of quiet deterioration. Dostoevsky's deepest insight into evil concerns its relationship to freedom. Evil is not an accident that better social engineering could eliminate, it is an inevitable consequence of freedom itself. If people are truly free to choose between good and evil, some of them will choose evil. If people are capable of genuine love, they are capable of genuine hatred. Freedom necessarily includes the freedom to choose wrongly, which means evil can never be fully eliminated from human existence. This does not mean passivity in the face of evil, or that we should stop working to reduce suffering and injustice. But it does mean any political system promising to end evil through reform alone is either naive or dishonest, and any theory that reduces evil entirely to mental illness or social dysfunction is missing something essential about what it means to be human. Dostoevsky also saw that the attempt to eliminate evil often creates worse evils. Once people become convinced they can perfect human nature through rational planning, they grow willing to use extreme measures against anyone who resists the plan. If crime is caused by social conditions rather than individual choice, then criminals bear no responsibility. But those who perpetuate the conditions become the real villains, deserving whatever fate the reformers choose to impose. This logic leads inevitably toward persecuting anyone who stands in the way of progress. The revolutionaries of demons begin with genuine concern for the oppressed, but their commitment to ideology gradually overwhelms their basic decency until they are willing to lie, steal, and murder, convincing themselves that personal hatred is really noble commitment to justice and becoming, in the end, more destructive than the problems they set out to solve. The only realistic response to evil for Dostoevsky is spiritual rather than political. We cannot eliminate it through better institutions. We can only combat it through individual moral and spiritual transformation. Each person confronting the capacity for evil within their own heart and choosing, again and again, to struggle against it. This struggle never ends and never wins final victory in this life. But it is the only way to hold on to our humanity in the face of the darkness that surrounds and runs through us, and, on occasion, through grace and genuine repentance, it opens a path to real redemption. No philosophical problem tormented Dostoevsky more deeply than the existence of innocent suffering. How can a loving, all-powerful God permit children to be tortured, abused, and killed? How can we believe in divine justice in a world full of undeserved pain and seemingly random cruelty? Most religious thinkers answer with theological explanations about free will, the greater good, or the mysterious workings of providence. Dostoevsky was too honest and too well acquainted with suffering himself to accept easy answers. Instead, he presented the problem in its starkest and most emotionally devastating form. The most powerful statement of it comes through Ivan Karamazov in the Brothers Karamazov. Ivan is a brilliant intellectual, versed in philosophy and theology, who understands every traditional argument for why a good God permits evil. But he has also collected, from newspapers, from historical record, detailed accounts of real children tortured and murdered by adults. And when he confronts that reality, the theological explanations collapse into meaninglessness. Ivan tells his brother Alyosha about a 5-year-old girl whose parents tortured her for minor infractions, beaten, locked overnight in a freezing outhouse, forced to eat her own excrement, praying to God for protection that never came until her parents finally tortured her to death. Ivan asks Alyosha a simple, devastating question. Can he understand why this small creature, unable even to understand what is being done to her, should have to beat her little fist against her chest in the cold and dark, weeping to a God who does nothing? He offers more stories, each worse than the last. A general who sets his hunting dogs on a peasant boy for injuring one of his hounds. Turkish soldiers who amuse themselves by tossing babies into the air and catching them on bayonets. These are not isolated horrors, but patterns that repeat across human history.
And every generation supplies fresh evidence that seems to mock any belief in cosmic justice. The standard religious answer is that God works in ways beyond human understanding, that suffering serves some purpose that will be revealed or compensated in eternity. Ivan rejects all of it as morally obscene. No greater good could justify the torture of a child. No eternal compensation could make up for undeserved agony. If cosmic harmony requires even one child's suffering as its price, Ivan wants nothing to do with such harmony. He is careful to specify that this is not atheism in the ordinary sense. He is not arguing that God doesn't exist. He is making a moral argument against the universe itself. Even if God exists, even if some ultimate plan would make everything right in the end, he would still refuse the ticket. Some things are too precious to be sacrificed for any purpose, however noble. The tears of a tortured child cannot be wiped away by any future happiness. This is rebellion not against God's existence, but against God's justice. Ivan's rebellion culminates in his own parable, the legend of the Grand Inquisitor, which the next segment takes up in full, in which he imagines Christ himself standing condemned before the very civilization built ostensibly in his name. The parable pushes the same question to its furthest edge. If God truly loves humanity, why does he permit suffering he has the power to prevent? The only apparent answer is that God values human freedom over human happiness, which means he is willing to sacrifice the welfare of actual particular people for the sake of an abstract principle. Is that love or cosmic cruelty in religious dress? Dostoevsky offers no easy way out of these questions. He presents Ivan's case with total intellectual honesty and emotional force, but he also shows us its cost. Ivan's rejection of God's world leads him toward nihilistic despair. If there is no cosmic justice, there are no objective moral truths. If innocent suffering is meaningless, all human striving is meaningless. If God does not care about human welfare, then perhaps nothing does. Ivan's own intellectual integrity carries him to conclusions that make life unbearable. The alternative is his brother Alyosha, who accepts the mystery of innocent suffering without being able to explain it. Alyosha has no better theological arguments than Ivan does. He cannot say why children suffer any more clearly than his brother can. But he chooses to trust in God's goodness despite evidence that seems to contradict it. And he answers suffering, not with analysis, but with practical love and compassion. He cannot solve the problem of evil. He can work to reduce the actual suffering of actual people in front of him. His faith rests not on argument, but on direct experience of grace. Dostoevsky suggests, finally, that the problem of innocent suffering cannot be solved by philosophy. It can only be lived through and answered with love. This does not make the suffering any less real or any less tragic, but it offers a way to hold on to both intellectual honesty and spiritual hope in the face of the deepest mystery life presence. The Grand Inquisitor chapter of the Brothers Karamazov is perhaps the most powerful political parable ever written. In a few pages, Dostoevsky manages to anticipate the appeal of authoritarian movements and expose the fundamental tension between human freedom and human happiness, a story within Ivan's larger rebellion against God's world, but one whose implications reach far beyond theology into the deepest questions of political philosophy. The setting is 16th century Spain, at the height of the Inquisition. Christ has returned to earth and walks the streets of Seville, quietly performing miracles and comforting the suffering. The people recognize him at once and gather around him in wonder. The Grand Inquisitor, the Church's highest authority, watches with alarm and has him arrested. That night, the Inquisitor visits Christ in his cell and delivers a long monologue explaining why the Church must reject and execute him. The argument is as chilling as it is logically compelling. The Inquisitor concedes that this is indeed Christ and that his original teaching was authentic, but insists that Christ made a fundamental error about human nature. He offered humanity freedom. But freedom is a burden most people cannot bear. The vast majority are weak, ignorant, spiritually immature. They do not want the responsibility of choosing for themselves. They want to be told what to believe and how to live. They want relief from the agonizing work of thinking and choosing. The Church, the Inquisitor claims, has corrected Christ's mistake by giving people exactly what they actually want rather than what Christ believed they should want, making their choices for them, providing authoritative answers instead of demanding struggle and doubt. He builds his case around the three temptations Satan offered Christ in the wilderness, each, he argues, answering a real human need that Christ's rejection of it left unmet. The first temptation was to turn stones into bread, the promise to solve material need. Christ refused, insisting people do not live by bread alone. But the Inquisitor points out that most people, hungry or homeless or insecure, cannot spare attention for spiritual matters at all. By refusing to solve the problem of want, Christ condemned the majority of humanity to lives dominated by anxiety over basic survival. The second temptation was to throw himself from the temple and be saved by angels, proof of divinity through undeniable miracle, the power to compel belief through evidence rather than leave it to be freely chosen. Christ refused this too, insisting faith must be chosen, not forced. But the Inquisitor argues that most people are tormented by doubt and desperately want certainty. They cannot bear the ambiguity that comes with freely chosen faith. By withholding proof, Christ left humanity to struggle alone with unanswerable questions about God's existence and nature. The third temptation was dominion over all the kingdoms of the earth, the power to build a perfect political order. Christ refused again, insisting his kingdom was not of this world. But the Inquisitor argues that most people need strong leadership and clear order to live decent lives.
They cannot handle the chaos that comes with political freedom. By refusing earthly power, Christ left humanity to war, injustice, and disorder. The Inquisitor's conclusion is that Satan understood human nature better than Christ did, that bread, miracle, and authority are exactly what most people actually need,
and that the Church has embraced all three, taking upon itself the burden of decisions the mass of humanity cannot bear to make for itself. This, the Inquisitor insists, is not betrayal but compassion, mercy for the weak, offered at the cost of the Church's own spiritual purity, which its leaders will happily be damned for. The argument is terrifying precisely because it contains enough truth to be plausible. How many people really want the responsibility of choosing their own moral and spiritual path? How many would rather have security than freedom, certainty than truth, strong leaders than the difficult work of self-governance? The Inquisitor's vision of humanity is cynical, but not obviously false. Dostoevsky wrote this decades before fascism and communism rose to power, yet the parable anticipates their appeal with unnerving precision, promises to solve material want through centralized control, to supply certainty through official ideology, to relieve ordinary people of political responsibility through strong leadership. Millions embraced these systems in no small part because they offered relief from the burden of freedom, which is also why democratic societies remain permanently fragile. Democracy demands that citizens educate themselves, make hard choices, and live with the consequences. It is always easier to let someone else decide and blame them when it goes wrong. Dostoevsky does not end the parable with the Inquisitor's monologue. After listening in silence to the entire argument, Christ responds not with words, but with a single gesture. He approaches the old man and kisses him gently on his aged lips. No argument, no rebuttal, only love offered to a man who has lost his way. The Inquisitor is visibly moved. He does not change his mind. He releases his prisoner and tells him never to return. Christ leaves in silence, and the Inquisitor goes back to his work of managing humanity for what he believes is its own good. The ending suggests that the choice between freedom and security cannot be settled by argument alone. Both positions carry real logic. Christ represents faith in human potential and the conviction that freedom is worth its cost. The Inquisitor represents a compassionate realism about human limitation. Each position holds both truth and error, and the tension between them cannot be fully resolved, which is exactly why the choice remains before us, individually and collectively, in every generation. The path of freedom, with its risks and its painful responsibilities, or the path of security, with its comforts and its quiet dependency. Neither choice is obviously right. Both exact a price, but the choice itself cannot be avoided, and its consequences will shape more than any one life. They cannot handle the chaos that comes with political freedom. By refusing earthly power, Christ left humanity to war, injustice, and disorder. The Inquisitor's conclusion is that Satan understood human nature better than Christ did, that bread, miracle, and authority are exactly what most people actually need, and that the Church has embraced all three, taking upon itself the burden of decisions the mass of humanity cannot bear to make for itself. This, the Inquisitor insists, is not betrayal but compassion, mercy for the weak, offered at the cost of the Church's own spiritual purity, which its leaders will happily be damned for. The argument is terrifying precisely because it contains enough truth to be plausible. How many people really want the responsibility of choosing their own moral and spiritual path? How many would rather have security than freedom, certainty than truth, strong leaders than the difficult work of self-governance?
The inquisitor's vision of humanity is cynical, but not obviously false. Dostoevsky wrote this decades before fascism and communism rose to power, yet the parable anticipates their appeal with unnerving precision, promises to solve material want through centralized control, to supply certainty through official ideology, to relieve ordinary people of political responsibility through strong leadership. Millions embraced these systems in no small part because they offered relief from the burden of freedom, which is also why democratic societies remain permanently fragile. Democracy demands that citizens educate themselves, make hard choices, and live with the consequences. It is always easier to let someone else decide and blame them when it goes wrong. Dostoevsky does not end the parable with the inquisitor's monologue. After listening in silence to the entire argument, Christ responds not with words, but with a single gesture. He approaches the old man and kisses him gently on his aged lips. No argument, no rebuttal, only love offered to a man who has lost his way. The inquisitor is visibly moved. He does not change his mind. He releases his prisoner and tells him never to return. Christ leaves in silence, and the inquisitor goes back to his work of managing humanity for what he believes is its own good. The ending suggests that the choice between freedom and security cannot be settled by argument alone. Both positions carry real logic. Christ represents faith in human potential and the conviction that freedom is worth its cost. The inquisitor represents a compassionate realism about human limitation. Each position holds both truth and error, and the tension between them cannot be fully resolved, which is exactly why the choice remains before us, individually and collectively, in every generation. The path of freedom, with its risks and its painful responsibilities, or the path of security, with its comforts and its quiet dependency. Neither choice is obviously right. Both exact a price, but the choice itself cannot be avoided, and its consequences will shape more than any one life. The political implications of this vision were profound and troubling to Western readers. If Russian Orthodoxy represented true Christianity, then Russia carried a messianic mission to save the world from Western materialism and spiritual corruption, a vision Dostoevsky believed would come to a head in a final spiritual battle between orthodoxy and Western secularism, with no real middle ground between them. This religious nationalism was both the strength and the weakness of his spiritual vision. It gave him genuine insight into the emptiness of modern secular culture and the psychological appeal of fanaticism in its many forms. But it also led him to idealize Russian culture in ways that ignored its real limitations. The Russia he loved was more a spiritual symbol than a historical reality, and a vision this powerful, when translated into political action, carries real danger along with its real insight. At the deepest level of Dostoevsky's philosophy lies a simple but revolutionary claim. Love is not merely one human emotion among others, not a psychological drive or social bond. Love is the fundamental force holding the universe together, the final answer to every philosophical question he raises. This is not the sentimental love of popular culture, nor the rational benevolence of moral philosophers. It is a cosmic principle that manifests most clearly in suffering, sacrifice, and the willingness to bear the pain of others. For Dostoevsky, love in this ultimate sense is identical with God,
This conviction grew out of his own experience of suffering and transformation. In the Siberian prison camp, he witnessed the worst of human nature, but also unexpected compassion. Hardened criminals risking themselves for fellow prisoners, acts of kindness with no rational payoff, moments when the boundary between self and others seemed to dissolve. These experiences convinced him that beneath the surface of human cruelty lay a deeper reality of universal love, capable of transforming even the most degraded soul. But his concept of love was paradoxical. True love, he believed, could only emerge through the full acceptance of suffering. Those who tried to avoid pain, their own or others, could never develop the depth genuine love requires. Those who pursued happiness as a primary goal remained trapped in a kind of superficiality. Only those willing to embrace suffering as a path to growth could transcend the boundaries of the ego and participate in the love that connects all beings, which meant love often looked like its opposite: tragedy, loss, heartbreak, rather than simple joy. Prince Mishkin in The Idiot represents pure, innocent love that seeks nothing for itself. But his love is tragic. It cannot protect him or those he loves from suffering, and his very goodness becomes, in a world unprepared to receive it, a source of destruction. Yet Dostoevsky suggests his apparent failure is a kind of success. Love plants seeds that may bear fruit later, even when it cannot prevent suffering in the moment. Alyosha Karamazov represents a more mature, practical love, one that has learned to work within the limits of human nature rather than trying to save everyone through sheer force of goodness. He responds to each person with acts of compassion suited to the moment, listening without judging, forgiving without conditions, helping without expecting gratitude. His love is quiet, but it transforms almost everyone he touches. Proof for Dostoevsky that love can be both completely selfless and completely practical at once. Against these figures stand characters like Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, and the Underground Man, brilliant, sensitive, and utterly unable to break through to genuine connection with others. Their intelligence becomes a prison that separates them from the ordinary flow of life and love. They understand everything except the one thing that matters most: how to love and be loved. Their tragedy is not that they are evil, but that they are cut off from the source of all meaning and joy. And Dostoevsky believed this isolation was the fundamental problem of modern civilization itself. Rationalism, individualism, and materialism teach people to see themselves as separate atoms competing for scarce resources in an indifferent universe. A worldview that makes genuine love nearly impossible because it assumes self-interest and altruism are opposed by nature. The alternative Dostoevsky offers is what he called sobornost, a Russian Orthodox concept of spiritual unity achieved through love, not mere cooperation or social solidarity, but a mystical participation in the love that connects all beings. Those who experience it discover that their deepest interests are not separate from the interests of others, but identical with them. That the boundary between self and other is a kind of illusion built by the ego. Father Zosima in the Brothers. Karamazov embodies this ideal most completely. He teaches that every person is responsible for everyone else, that all suffering is shared suffering. When one person sins, all humanity is diminished. When one is redeemed, all humanity is lifted. This is not a moral obligation imposed from outside, but a spiritual reality visible to those who have learned to love truly, which is why Zosima can see Christ in every person he meets. Dostoevsky was too honest to present love as an easy solution. True love requires enormous sacrifice and often looks, from the outside, like failure. Those who love most deeply often suffer most intensely because they open themselves to the pain of others as well as their own. Love does not eliminate evil or prevent tragedy. It transforms the meaning of both, a transformation that is real, though often invisible to anyone judging by ordinary standards of success. And love, Dostoevsky understood, can be corrupted too. Possessive love that seeks to control is disguised selfishness. Sentimental love that avoids hard choices is a form of self-indulgence. Ideological love that claims to serve humanity while ignoring the actual people in front of it is a species of fanaticism. True love demands wisdom and courage, which is exactly why so few people ever fully achieve it.
The ultimate test for Dostoevsky is forgiveness. Anyone can love the kind and the deserving. Only those transformed by grace can love their enemies and see the divine image in someone who appears wholly evil. A recognition, not merely an ethical choice, that all human beings share the same fundamental nature beneath their surface differences. Those capable of this kind of love become, in his vision, channels through which something larger enters the world. Unable to eliminate suffering or solve every problem, but able to change the spiritual atmosphere around them, reminding others of possibilities they had forgotten and hopes they had abandoned. Writing in the 1870s, decades before the rise of fascism and communism, Dostoevsky captured, in his novel Demons, a portrait of revolutionary terrorism whose psychology and tactics readers of the 20th century would find eerily familiar. His insight went deeper than political forecasting. He understood the spiritual and psychological roots from which this kind of movement grows, at a moment when most of his contemporaries dismissed his political novels as overreactions to minor unrest. Later history would give his warnings far more weight than they received at the time. His central insight was that totalitarianism emerges not from traditional authoritarianism, but from the collapse of traditional belief and institution. Old-style tyrants claimed authority through divine right, inherited legitimacy, or conquest. They ruled through fear and force, but rarely tried to control every aspect of a subject's inner life or remake human nature itself. Modern totalitarianism, by contrast, tends to emerge from movements that present themselves as democratic and egalitarian, as servants of humanity working to eliminate suffering and build a perfect society. That framing makes the tyranny that follows far harder to see coming and far harder to resist. Dostoevsky traced this new tyranny to the philosophical currents gaining ground among European intellectuals of his day. If materialism is true, if human beings are nothing more than complex machines governed by physical and social law, then human behavior can be predicted and controlled by manipulating the right conditions. If rationalism is true, if reason alone can solve every human problem, then those who possess superior rational knowledge acquire the right, even the obligation, to impose their plans on everyone else. If atheism is true, if there are no objective moral truths, then moral values become nothing more than human constructions, changeable at will to serve political ends. Combine these premises which seemed progressive and humane to 19th century liberals. And you have the intellectual foundation for a politics with no inherent limit on what may be done to a human being in service of a social goal. Demons dramatizes how these abstractions translate into action. Its revolutionary characters begin with genuine concern for injustice and a sincere wish to help the oppressed. But their commitment to ideological purity gradually overwhelms their basic decency. They become willing to lie, steal, and murder for the cause, having convinced themselves that their own moral scruples are simply obstacles standing between them and the greater good. They develop elaborate justifications for acts they would once have called obviously evil, producing a form of wrongdoing more dangerous than ordinary criminality because it operates with a clear conscience and claims moral legitimacy for itself. Dostoevsky saw too that this kind of fanaticism appeals particularly to educated young people who have lost traditional religious faith but retained the need for meaning. A revolutionary cause offers a sense of mission that secular culture struggles to provide, the feeling that one's life matters in some ultimate sense, that one stands on the winning side of history. Revolutionary movements function in this reading as substitute religions for people who can no longer believe in the old ones. But he also saw that such movements inevitably betray their own founding ideals and turn tyrannical, because the same assumptions that justified violence against the old order will just as easily justify control over the new one. If people are rational machines, they can be re-engineered to behave in socially useful ways. If individual preference conflicts with collective goals, individual preference will have to give way. The character of Shigalov in Demons embodies this progression precisely. Beginning with the goal of perfect equality and freedom for all, and discovering, when he works out the practical implications of his own logic, that perfect equality requires the total elimination of individual freedom. He presents this not as a betrayal of his ideals, but as their fulfillment.
Dostoevsky also anticipated that such movements would use terror not merely as a tool for seizing power, but as a technique for reshaping consciousness itself, breaking down the social bonds and moral inhibitions that might otherwise interfere with ideological conformity, until people living under constant threat of denunciation learn to suppress their own thoughts and become psychologically dependent on the very system oppressing them, because it has become their only source of security and meaning. The novel's most chilling scenes are not its violence, but its portraits of individuals systematically broken down through ideological pressure and social isolation, not argued out of their resistance, but stripped of the capacity for independent thought that resistance requires. Perhaps his most far-reaching insight concerns the religious dimension of movements like these. They are not merely political, but function as religions in their own right, offering a comprehensive worldview that explains everything and promises ultimate salvation, demanding not obedience alone, but faith, their own rituals, their own martyrs, their own promise of a kind of immortality through identification with the cause. This religious quality, Dostoevsky believed, is what makes such movements so much more durable than ordinary political tyranny. They answer spiritual needs that secular culture leaves unmet. And the ultimate horror of totalitarianism, in his vision, is not that it makes people miserable, but that it can make them content with their misery. Populations who come to believe genuinely that their oppression is freedom and their degradation is dignity, who lose the capacity even to imagine an alternative. That is the complete triumph of evil, not merely the absence of goodness, but the erasure of any memory of what goodness looked like. It is the final victory of the Grand Inquisitor's vision over the vision of Christ. Long before existentialism became a recognized philosophical movement, Dostoevsky had already dramatized its central insights. Through characters like the underground man, Raskolnikov, and Ivan Karamazov, he explored the absurdity of existence, the burden of freedom, the anxiety of choice, and the search for authentic selfhood in a universe that offers no guarantees of meaning. But his existentialism differed from the secular existentialism that would emerge in the 20th century because it was grounded in genuine spiritual struggle rather than a rejection of every spiritual possibility. For Dostoevsky, the confrontation with meaninglessness was not the end of the philosophical journey, but the beginning of a deeper search for transcendent meaning. The underground man is the first fully developed existentialist figure in literature. He is acutely aware that his existence precedes any meaning he might try to impose on it. He knows he is radically free to choose who he wants to be, and that this freedom is a terrible burden most people try to escape. He recognizes that human institutions and values are constructions rather than objective features of reality, and that reason itself has no transcendent authority to appeal to. Insights that anticipate existentialist philosophy by decades. But his response to these insights differs sharply from what later existentialists would propose. Instead of embracing his freedom and building his own values, he is paralyzed by the recognition of how much responsibility that freedom places on him. Instead of affirming life, despite its apparent meaninglessness, he retreats into bitter isolation. He shows us what happens when existentialist insight is cut loose from any transcendent framework that might give it positive direction. Without God, or some equivalent source of value, existential freedom curdles into a curse. Dostoevsky's characters are equally notable for their divided selves, not unified personalities but battlegrounds where conflicting impulses and beliefs struggle for dominance. Raskolnikov contains both a potential saint and a potential criminal, and his actions emerge from whichever wins temporarily. Ivan Karamazov is simultaneously believer and atheist, capable of real religious insight and equally real religious rebellion. This kind of division raises what we might call the problem of authenticity. If a person contains multiple conflicting selves, which one is the true one? If conscious values conflict with unconscious drive and actual behavior, which should be trusted? These questions torment Dostoevsky's characters and drive their most desperate attempts at some kind of unified selfhood. Attempts that usually fail because the division runs through the structure of consciousness itself. Yet this divided consciousness is both burden and opportunity in Dostoevsky's telling. The same self-awareness that makes authentic action difficult also makes moral growth possible. The same capacity for self-observation that produces anxiety also enables genuine self-knowledge and repentance. Without the ability to step outside ourselves and observe our own thoughts, we would be no different from animals acting on instinct. The divide is the price of being human, and also what makes being human, in the fullest sense, possible at all. His work also explores what would later be called bad faith, the tendency to deny one's own freedom and responsibility by pretending to be determined by forces outside oneself. Raskolnikov tells himself his murder was justified by his theory of extraordinary individuals. really an attempt to avoid facing the fact that he freely chose to kill. The underground man blames his misery on social conditions and psychological determinism, really an excuse for refusing to act. But Dostoevsky also shows us the alternative. Characters who achieve something close to what existentialists would later call authentic existence by fully accepting their freedom and its weight. Alyosha Karamazov does not appeal to external authority or deterministic explanation to escape responsibility for his choices. He accepts it while remaining open to grace from beyond himself. Sonia Marmeladova, in Crime and Punishment, freely chooses to sacrifice herself for her family, while holding on to her own dignity and integrity. Such authenticity is possible, Dostoevsky suggests, but it demands real courage and cannot be reached through intellectual analysis alone. This existential dimension surfaces most clearly around death. Dostoevsky's characters are constantly aware that they will die, and that this fact threatens to make everything they do meaningless from a cosmic vantage point, a paradox that cuts both ways. If life is short, every choice matters enormously because there may be no chance to correct a mistake. But if death renders everything meaningless in the end, then perhaps no choice matters at all, since every path arrives at the same destination. Prince Mishkin in The Idiot offers one striking response to this predicament. His epilepsy gives him what he experiences as direct access to a kind of eternal moment beyond time and death, allowing him to live with an unusual completeness of presence. But that same knowledge makes him unable to function within ordinary social reality, because he cannot take seriously the things most people consider urgent. He embodies both the possibility and the cost of transcending the normal existential predicament, authenticity purchased at the price of practical effectiveness. Dostoevsky's influence on later existentialist thought was substantial, if often unacknowledged. Nietzsche's concept of the overman and his critique of conventional morality owe a real debt to characters like Raskolnikov and Ivan Karamazov. Sartre's account of bad faith and the burden of freedom draws directly on insights Dostoevsky dramatized decades earlier. Camus' treatment of the absurd and the rebel carries the visible imprint of the underground man and Ivan Karamazov both. Even Heidegger's analysis of authentic existence and being toward death reflects, in philosophical language, what Dostoevsky had already explored in psychological terms. But his existentialism remained open to religious possibility in a way most of what followed did not. Where 20th century existentialists typically assumed God's absence and set out to construct meaning entirely through human effort, Dostoevsky treated the confrontation with meaninglessness as a necessary passage toward authentic faith rather than its replacement. His characters achieve genuine authenticity not by rejecting transcendence, but by moving through despair toward a deeper spiritual understanding. For him, existential honesty about the human condition did not conflict with religious faith. It required such faith to keep from collapsing into nihilistic despair. That religious dimension makes his work more hopeful in the end than much of the existentialist literature that came after it.